wasn't born, it was made. In 1919, 4 profoundly famous film artists came together to form an organization that would fix forever the position of the star at the top of the Hollywood pyramid. Modern movie makers still reflect the hopes and goals of that February morning when Mary Pickford, D.W. Griffith, Douglas Fairbanks, and Charlie Chaplin inked the deal that created United Artists.
When United Artists was formed, all of these stars were looking for some sort of freedom. With this new company, Mary Pickford, for example, could have her say on almost every aspect of the filmmaking process, from the very beginning of the process to the very end.
It provided for them with a company which would distribute films which they would create themselves. These would be the stars, the ones who were out front anyway, to be their own bosses and to select their own directors and everyone connected with the organization. And if they failed, they failed. If they succeeded, they all succeeded together.
The founders of this new company had already risen from anonymous faces on a screen to unparalleled fame. In a period of less than 10 years, they had transformed their fledgling industry. Yet, when they began, there was no such thing as a star. As contract players in the original studio system, even the most successful actors received no more than $5 to $10 a day. The movies weren't about people when they started. The movies were about patents and technology. In the beginning, the movies were about machines. The flickers were a technological novelty, a simple sideshow amusement with no pretensions toward art. Thomas Alva Edison was the first real titan of the movie business. His company was one of the first and leading creator of that new novelty, moving pictures.
The reason for making these films that Edison did in these early days was to run them through the Edison kinetoscope. Now, the kinetoscope was an invention of his that would run film through a machine, and then you could put a nickel in and see a short film. This was a great novelty of the time. This was really the motivation for Edison to continue in this whole business. It was the business of nickels.
He was also a master of another American institution, the lawsuit. Edison fought long and hard to protect his investment. He couldn't patent film itself. George Eastman had already done that, so Edison patented the holes. It was this modest innovation that permitted successive frames on a moving strip of film to be accurately positioned behind the aperture of camera or projector. It was the trick that made the movies move. In 1910, Los Angeles, California had no movie industry. The state was sparsely populated and mostly rural. The hardy souls who chose this coast so far from civilization were building a new life for themselves that usually involved ranching or mining. On this January morning, a train pulls into the station. It is at the end of a cross-country trek, and among the exiting passengers is a tall, slender man, accompanied by a lovely young woman. He surveys the scene. A beak of a nose and sharp, piercing eyes are visible beneath the broad brim of his hat. The young woman, barely more than a girl, possesses soft alabaster skin, high cheekbones, and a delicate pouting mouth. They are Mary Pickford and David Wark Griffith. They've left the East Coast, where stormy winters can slow film production to a snail's pace. They have come to make movies where the sun shines all year long. And today, no one watching their arrival knows their names. D.W. Griffith had brought a choice team of fewer than 30 actors and technicians to continue winter production, unabated for the budget-conscious Biograph company. They constructed open-air sets on a rented lot and produced a different 20-minute film every 2 days. To the Biograph Company and other studios, films were not art. They were just cheap sideshow novelties designed to make a buck. Movie actors and movie directors were no more important than any other factory workers. Actors were rarely admired outside the theater, and movie actors were the lowest of a low and scandalous breed. But that was changing, and in great part due to David Wark Griffith. The son of a Confederate colonel, he was proud of his Southern heritage. His father had served with distinction in the Civil War, a recent wound in the nation's history. After the war, the Griffith family fell on hard times, as did much of the South. D.W. resolved to go into the theater. His mother chided him. The Griffith men have indulged in many things, but no one has fallen so low as to become an actor. At first, he wrote plays and poems while making a meager living with a traveling theater group. 10 years later, in 1907, at the age of 32, Griffith stepped in front of the black box used to make the flickers. His performances were unexceptional, but then something happened that changed the course of film and popular culture. D.W. Griffith got behind the camera. From his first effort, his films sell twice as many copies as the average Biograph film.
The Biograph Company represented unusual films. They had films relating to crime, relating to action, relating to love, relating to all kinds of subjects that the public had never seen before. Now, when D.W. Griffith came there, he was continuing this trend of diverse films, but using new techniques that other directors and he himself had been developing. Shots in which you move with the camera, unusual cutting, editing techniques to bring up suspense and double exposures. All of this fascinated the audiences of those days.
D.W. Griffith had realized something about the movies which most of the industry had not. The camera can help to tell the story instead of just observing it. D.W. Griffith used the camera to become a master storyteller.
And all the new innovations D.W. Griffith was doing for the company led Biograph to great successes during the early silent era.
Before Griffith's heyday at Biograph, other directors played their scenes in front of flat sets, their stationary camera work adding nothing to the story. By comparison, in The Girl and Her Trust, Griffith first used a technique very commonplace today, the tracking shot, in this case made from a moving automobile. Griffith's clever use of movement, camera angle, and the pace of his cuts all contribute to the narrative, creating a seamless flow of action and an exciting story. His techniques allowed the audience to become more involved in the stories by becoming more involved in the acting itself. He and his brilliant cameraman, Billy Bitzer, invented, developed, or refined these innovations through hundreds of short films made in rapid succession. But the thing that made Griffith stand out was the close-up. He knew an actor could draw the audience in. If you looked into someone's eyes, you could see the soul. His audiences couldn't help but empathize. When he brought his troupe to California, he took advantage of other assets, the wide open spaces and dramatic environment. He left his studio and moved his crew to a small town near Los Angeles, a sleepy suburb nestled against hills he wished to use as a backdrop. The town is called Hollywood. He was inventing the art of film direction, and his innovations were dizzying. He proudly declared, "The motion picture is no longer an infant art. I firmly believe the day will come when great poetic pictures will compare with the greatest productions of grand opera. I am not a dreamer in the sense that I see fantastic things unlikely of realization. I haven't dreamed an impossible thing in 7 years of work." In 423 films made at Biograph between 1908 and 1913, stars like Lillian and Dorothy Gish, the comic madman Max Sennett, all saw the light of cinema under Griffith's direction. As great as they were, there was one Griffith protégé who outshone them all. They called her America's Sweetheart, and she was one of the first of the international superstars, Mary Pickford. She was born Gladys Smith in Toronto in 1893. At the age of 5, she went on stage as Baby Gladys in order to support her widowed mother and her younger brother and sister. She began a steady climb to stardom. She reached it in the theater in 1907. At age 15, she was in a Broadway hit produced by theater legend David Belasco. But even a year and a half of that left her with barely $200 to her name. Even though people had begun to take notice of D.W. Griffith's work at Biograph Studios, movie acting was still considered beneath the dignity of most stars of the legitimate stage. But Broadway could not offer year-round employment. Without air conditioning during the hot summers, an outdoor movie set could be a very pleasant place to work.
People in those days only went into movies to kill time in the summertime because the theater didn't do well in summer. 6 months running a play in New York was a big run. Most of them ran for maybe 3 months, 4 months, a hit even. But a big hit ran for 6 months. So what to do in the summer? They went out to California and made a movie. Griffith, who had a big reputation in those days, having made films respectable to the public, managed to get people around him, like my father and my stepmother Mary. She was a big success and liked the medium. She seemed to be able to do anything and everything which the theater couldn't do.
It was Mary's mother, Charlotte, who coaxed her into dropping by to see Griffith, and he tested her on the spot. Pickford thought the test went terribly, and Griffith reportedly raged at her when she broke character in the middle of a scene. He told her she was too small and too fat, but at the end of that first session at Biograph, he offered her $10 a day, twice the going rate. Years later, Pickford recalled for the microphone memories of her first day on the job.
There I am in the back of the set. This is my very first day in a motion picture studio. You will note that my hair photographed dark. That was because the lighting was so poor that all blondes looked like brunettes. But honestly, I've always been a blonde. This was called the Jones series. That was Florence Lawrence and Billy Compton.
Florence Lawrence and others were considered the first movie stars, but they were playing more serious kinds of roles that had to do with love and marriage. Now, Mary Pickford was playing a free young spirit, young children doing pranks, all kinds of roles, from rich girls to poor girls. There was something about her that was very special that lives on to this day.
Beginning modestly at first, Pickford rapidly gained confidence in the new medium. From her start of $10 a day, within weeks she was making $25. Within a few years, she was making $10,000 a week. Still later, Little Mary, as she was known, would become the first woman in America to earn over $1 million in a single year.
She was a darn good actress, one of the best. She had this little girl appeal, even though she was a full-grown woman. And she was a darn intelligent woman, was the boss even when she was on the way up. She told her bosses what to do. Eventually, she became the boss herself.
Though her name was never listed by Biograph, audiences recognized her because Griffith used her time and time again as he turned out film after film. In her, he saw a fascinating balance between sweetness and spunk. She was the perfect Griffith heroine, part willful child and part soulful woman. The camera simply loved her, and Griffith knew it. For her part, Pickford loved the camera right back. She became an eager student of her new medium, and she became a skilled film artist. She worried about makeup and costume. Cameraman Billy Bitzer, an ardent admirer, reported, Mary first used one makeup and, when she saw herself on screen, would reblend it and come to me. "Do you think this is better, Billy?" she would ask. Under the lights, we would study it as if we were artists mixing colors for their canvas. Her ideas and her artistry as an actress were even more important than her devotion to other elements of the craft. Acting for film was heavily influenced by stage acting. After all, that was the only kind of acting anyone had ever seen. The two are radically different. Stage acting in 1910 was a pretty big affair. You had to make sure that the audience heard and understood you all the way to the back of the house. Since movies were silent, actors didn't have to worry about being heard, but they still carried on with the exaggerated theatrical movements of the stage. Directors didn't stop them because they didn't know any better. Mary Pickford understood that when the camera came in close, something else was called for. She knew the power in those eyes of hers, and she was precise with it. She showed actors how to be on screen, and audiences responded to her stunning artistry. T.W. Griffith supported credits for his actors, but Biograph's owners thought it was preposterous to tell the public who the actors were. Who cared? Everyone did, as it turns out. After a few projects at other studios, Pickford teamed up with producer Adolf Zucker to star in Tess of the Storm Country, the first picture which put an actor's name up on the marquee. A week after Tess opened in 1914, Mary Pickford was on her way to becoming one of the most famous people in the entire world.
Even though she was older than what she was playing most of the time, this beloved feeling from the public around the world, I might add, and not just in Los Angeles or New York, was so deep that when Mary Pickford visited Russia sometime in the 1920s, she was mobbed there by thousands and thousands of people. Doug and Mary were afraid they couldn't even get out.
"1914 was also a critical year for Griffith because it was the year in which he made the film which crystallized everything he had learned. Griffith left Biograph in 1913 after completing an ambitious 4-reel film called Judith of Bethulia. Biograph simply wasn't interested in his vision of film as art or film as epic. His carefully honed techniques were to be used to make 1 and 2 reelers, and that was all. Griffith was far too ambitious for Biograph. He was inspired by the early Italian film epics like Quo Vadis and Cabiria. Griffith had a 12-reeler in mind, the 175-minute story of the North versus the South, his version of the Civil War and the Reconstruction.
The film The Birth of a Nation, having to do with the Civil War, dredged up old wounds. Now, between 1910 and 1915, there were still people living from the Civil War. They remembered the Civil War vividly. There were controversies when the film opened in which people were picketing. Now, black people were picketing because they were shown in the film in a bad light. Around the world, people were talking about D.W. Griffith as being the controversial director.
Viewed today, Griffith's masterpiece, Birth of a Nation, retains strongly racist undertones. Its climax contains the rescue of a white woman from a mulatto by the Ku Klux Klan. The film was attacked in the courts and in public by the newly formed NAACP, but the real irony of the film, as protesters observed, was how everyone was swept up in the cinematic magic which Griffith wrought, even those deeply offended by its overt racism. President Woodrow Wilson himself simply said, "It's like writing history with lightning." Griffith had finally proved that movies were art, and that movies were here to stay. The film premiered in January of 1915, and it played for an unheard of 7 months in Los Angeles. It made millions on a $100,000 investment. It made Griffith immortal. The next year, 1916, the movies had truly taken over. Legitimate theaters everywhere began to close their doors in the face of this advancing giant. The movies could now offer the spectacle of Griffith or the hope and innocence of Mary Pickford. But the original appeal of the flickers depended greatly on comedy, and here too there was a newly anointed king, a man who wore the clothes of a little tramp, Charles Chaplin. Within a few years, he would eclipse virtually every performer on the screen, but in 1915, he was just hitting his stride. Charlie Chaplin was born in London in 1889, the son of music hall entertainers. As hard luck pursued his family life, Charlie met with some success as a performer on stage at the age of 5. By the time he was 17, he landed a job with one of Fred Karno's traveling variety troupes.
Fred Karno was one of several different troupes that traveled all around the world, showing a particular type of English comedy, which had a lot to do with pantomime and slapstick. Now, Charlie Chaplin embodied these two areas to such perfection that he really formulated a whole new kind of comedy which nobody really had seen before.
The year 1910 found Chaplin in New York, the first of 2 American tours. Nearly 3 years later, the young man was tapped by Max Sennett, the comic genius behind the recently formed Keystone Cops and other comic series. Sennett's comedies were all done in his trademark style, wild, irrational antics that unfolded at a frenzied pace in a rapid succession of quick cuts that emphasized non-stop movement. They invariably ended in a chase. Improvised on the spot to fit a general idea or situation, the Keystone films were made in a few days each at a rustic outdoor studio near Los Angeles that had been recently converted from a ranch. Shy and uncertain, Chaplin reported for work in December 1913. In his first film, Making a Living, 26-year-old Charlie Chaplin played a smooth villain with high hat, frock coat, and drooping mustache. It was not an auspicious debut. Reporting to work for his second film, Chaplin was told, "We need some gags here. Put on a comedy makeup. Anything will do." Chaplin wrote, "I had no idea what makeup to put on. However, I wanted everything a contradiction. The pants baggy, the coat tight, the hat small, and the shoes large. I added a small mustache, which I reasoned would add age without hiding my expression. The moment I was dressed, the clothes and makeup made me feel the character. I began to know him, and by the time I walked on stage, he was fully born." The Little Tramp was a completely original creation. The young British actor's vagabond life and simple humanity added a second dimension to his comic prevarications and unexpected pathos. Chaplin first starred in and then began directing himself in a succession of one- and two-reel comedies. But throughout his one-year career with Keystone, Chaplin found himself at odds with Sennett. Chaplin's comedy was about character. For Sennett, all the gags merely served to set up the chase.
Charlie wanted to do more of this sophisticated kind of comedy. Now, Mack Sennett wanted to keep it down to a lower level, which really made him the money. But he was afraid that this more sophisticated comedy might be a failure, and that really started this up-and-down relationship between Charlie and Mack Sennett, which ended with Charlie actually leaving Mack Sennett altogether.
Asked about a second year's contract, Chaplin named an impossible price, $1,000 a week. He was certain that his newfound fame was fleeting, and he would have to make the most of it while he could. When Sennett failed to match his demands, Chaplin accepted a contract with a competitor and took his Little Tramp character with him. Chaplin's pictures became more ambitious. He was writer, director, and star, all rolled in one. He lavished great care on his productions, and instead of a picture every few days, he now turned out a two-reel comedy every 2 to 3 weeks. Naturally gregarious man, Chaplin found that as his fame increased, his social life did not keep pace. "Loneliness is repellent," he wrote. "Here I was at the apogee of my career, all dressed up and no place to go. How does one get to know people, interesting people?" It seemed that everyone knew me, but I knew no one. The popularity of the longer pictures was growing. His new producers took one Chaplin two-reeler and added extra scenes from the cutting room floor to make it a four-reeler. Chaplin was incensed, and thereafter made certain that future contracts forbade tinkering with his finished work. Nowadays, that's known as final cut, and it remains a crucial artistic right. In the next few years, Charlie Chaplin became one of the most famous men in the world. The Tramp, Easy Street, The Cure, The Pawn Shop, Shoulder Arms, and The Immigrant were all made during this period which Chaplin later recalled as the happiest in his life. But the work was getting harder. The combined pressures of phenomenal fame and the need to top himself in each picture brought Chaplin close to mental block at times. He wrote, "Sometimes a story would present a problem. I would lay off work and try to think, striding up and down in my dressing room in torment or sitting for hours at the back of a set. The mere sight of management or the actors gaping at me was embarrassing, especially as Mutual was paying the cost of the production." At the end of a fruitless day, Mr. Caulfield would meet me accidentally on purpose and inquire, "How's she coming?" "Lousy. I guess I'm through. I can't think anymore." And he would make a hollow laugh. "Oh, don't worry. It'll come." Amazingly, it did. Over and over again.
I remember the first time I had a starring part in a play, and after the opening night, everybody'd gone away, and Charlie had gone to the opening, and we sat outside the theater in the dark. There was hardly any traffic anymore. We just sat on the curbstone while he gave me advice as to what to do in the first act, in this scene and that scene, what not to do, what he did like, what he didn't like. It was marvelous.
In time, the interesting and artistic friends Chaplin craved came to him. World leaders like Winston Churchill wanted introductions, Anna Pavlova, and a host of other artists sought his company. French comic star Max Linder and inspirational leaders like Helen Keller became his friends. And through an elderly grande dame of the English theatre, Chaplin was introduced to another man with whom he would find much in common. Douglas Fairbanks. Chaplin met Fairbanks over a pool table at a Hollywood party. He later wrote, "That night was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. It was not for naught that Douglas captured the imagination and love of the public. The spirit of his pictures, their optimism and infallibility, were very much to the American taste. He had extraordinary magnetism and charm, and as I began to know him intimately, I found him disarmingly honest. Although Doug was tremendously popular, he generously praised other people's talent. He often said that Mary Pickford and I had genius, while he had only a small talent. This, of course, was not so. Douglas was creative and did things in a big way." Fairbanks was known for the physical stunts he performed in each of his films. As spontaneous as they appear, each stunt was choreographed in advance.
He took great care about it, weeks and weeks ahead of time. His ability to do all these stunts himself, work them out, design them, and do them, never had a double.
Six years older than Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks was a comparative latecomer to the movies. He was the son of a Southern belle and a successful Jewish lawyer who had separated when Douglas was 5 years old. Involved in amateur theater from an early age, he was a restless sort and remembered attending both Harvard University and the Colorado School of Mines without bothering to pick up degrees from either. By the time of his Broadway debut at the age of 19, he had done everything from clerking in a hardware store to working as a ship's steward on a transatlantic cattle freighter. 5 years into a promising career, he left to marry the daughter of an industrialist and to work in her father's soap factory. It didn't last. Before long, Douglas was back on Broadway. Lured to Hollywood by a juicy contract with Triangle Pictures, he worked briefly with none other than D.W. Griffith, who, it appears, failed to recognize or understand Fairbanks's appeal to the public. He once quipped of Fairbanks, "He's got a face like a cantaloupe, and he can't act." Perhaps. But, as Griffith himself had proved, the rules were changing in this new art form. Being a handsome actor just didn't apply in this case. Fairbanks was a force of nature.
Perpetual optimism, I think, was his main virtue. He projected out to the audience his own high spirits, his optimism that anything is possible, everything is possible. And never say no, never say die. Is that wall too high to climb? No, it isn't. Not able to climb it, we'll jump it. And that gave other people the feeling, well, if he can do it, I can do it too.
Within a year, Douglas Fairbanks had set up his own film company. First, he added producing to his talents. Then, bit by bit, he began to come up with the stories. They had names like Down to Earth, The Man from Painted Post, The Knickerbocker Buckaroo. And they sold tickets, too.
One interesting thing is you find that in most of the credits, he has down the bottom story by Elton Thomas. Now, Elton Thomas was his middle name. It's my middle name, too, Douglas Elton Thomas Fairbanks. But he didn't want to take the credit, so he always gave the credit to Elton Thomas.
To the public, Douglas Fairbanks made movies move. His gymnastic abilities and imagination created a series of can-you-top-this stunts that thrilled his audience. But though Fairbanks, with the success of his own production company, had the freedom to make virtually any story he wanted to make, he did not have much control over their distribution. His films were released through Paramount. The standard policies of the day required that film prints be sold at a set price per foot of film, regardless of the star performers or cost of production. Furthermore, theaters were required to buy films in groups. For an exhibitor to get a Fairbanks blockbuster, he might also be obligated to buy a series of run-of-the-mill films. For all these fledgling film artists, Griffith, Pickford, Chaplin, and Fairbanks, the possibilities of the film medium were in flux, constantly expanding, broader in scope, and more complex in execution with each succeeding year. Distributors, on the other hand, were trying to rein things in. They wanted regular products made to regular specification, one-size-fits-all entertainment. Independently, Griffith, Chaplin, Pickford, Fairbanks, none of them wanted any part of that. Between 1909 and 1918, Hollywood grew from an unknown spot on the map to the world leader in filmed entertainment. But it was still a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Mary Pickford was introduced to Douglas Fairbanks virtually upon his arrival in town. In a place where legends could be made or broken overnight, Griffith and Pickford were the old-timers, the pros, world famous by the time Chaplin and Fairbanks arrived on the scene. An admiring Douglas told Mary she was a true artist, saying, "You do less apparent acting than anyone else I know, and because of that, you express more." But his interest in Mary was greater than mere respect for a fellow professional. Fairbanks, the dashing hero, would be smitten with little Mary Pickford. Both were involved in unhappy marriages before they met, and soon they were the talk of the town.
She was always a wonderful friend, though, right up to the end. I adored her, and she was always very sweet about my mother and the delicate situation that existed, and then sort of settled itself in due course.
By Hollywood standards, it was a very long courtship, one that was very carefully orchestrated for the public. In 1917, Pickford, Fairbanks, and Chaplin went on a series of national tours promoting the sale of war bonds. Alternately pleading with and clowning for the crowds, the tours were phenomenally successful for the government. Douglas and Charlie traded quips and punches with none other than boxing champ Jack Dempsey. Everyone the best of buddies. The fervour of their patriotic pleas to the crowd was matched by the fervour of Fairbanks's courtship of Mary. Now the three friends, each having experienced phenomenal success in a different genre of film, were bound together. At the height of the Great War, while Pickford, Fairbanks and Chaplin were on Bond tours, David Wark Griffith had gone to England and France. Right before the war, Griffith created an artistic success and financial disaster in his epic Intolerance. Then he busied himself with the production of a propaganda epic, Hearts of the World, which included actual footage of soldiers in battle. Over the next few years, his closest professional association was with the star of that film, Lillian Gish. To the trio of film stars selling bonds back home, Griffith represented a father figure, a great artist of the cinema, the one director who shared their vision of what movies could be. By 1918, although each performing artist had their own producing company and had achieved certain concessions in film distribution, there were still significant impediments to creative freedom. In addition, certain business people in Hollywood thought the stars were getting too big for their britches. Rumors abounded near the end of 1918 that a merger of producing companies that would result in a monopoly of film distribution outlets was in the works. The net result of such a monopoly would be to force down star salaries and the overall cost of production. Their hard-won creative freedom in jeopardy, Chaplin and Fairbanks decided to check out the rumors. They hired two Pinkerton detectives, identified in reports only as Operator Number 5 and Operator Number 8, to spy on a meeting of production heads at the Alexandria Hotel in January 1919. Pinkerton Operator 8, an attractive woman and a regular Mata Hari, lured a producer into her bedroom. In the course of conversation, he waxed eloquent about industry plans. She reported, "I said I did not think it right for Mary and Charlie to receive such salary," and he said, "That's so, and their salary will have to be cut." I then asked if that was the reason he came to Los Angeles, and if he thought they would succeed, and he said, "Surely they will have to come to our terms." Within days, Chaplin and Fairbanks banded together with Mary Pickford and Western star William S. Hart. At Mary's suggestion, they included Griffith in the team. In grand manner, all five walked unannounced into the dining room of the Alexandria Hotel. Chaplin later wrote, "The effect was electric. One after another, the producers came to the entrance, took a look, then hurried out." Whenever one appeared in the dining room, Douglas would talk a lot of nonsense. Very soon, a half a dozen members of the press were sitting at our table taking notes as we issued our statement that we were forming a company of United Artists to protect our independence and combat the forthcoming merger. Together with their lawyers, the group reconvened at Mary's house within a few days. The only one missing was William S. Hart, who had been offered a rich contract with generous terms if he would abandon the United Artists deal. With the signing of an agreement that would allow each the creative and financial freedom they sought, a new era opened for the movies. No longer careless affairs to be sold at a set price by the foot, motion pictures now served their audience elaborate and sophisticated entertainment. And the people the audience paid to see were now, for the first time, fully in control. The lunatics have taken over the asylum, a rival executive sputtered. The threatened monopoly of motion picture distribution never materialized. A series of production heads from other studios laid siege to the new company, promising to lead United Artists to greatness if only they, too, could own a part of the business.
I suppose the thing is that there weren't many people capable of being like the United Artists were, that there weren't many stars, actors, who were also capable of being producers at the same time. And if they were capable of it, they could join this organization called United Artists. And later on, producers who were willing to give the artists considerable leeway, like Sam Goldwyn eventually did, became a member of that group.
Despite pre-existing contracts that kept Griffith, and especially Chaplin, tied up for some time, United Artists began distributing pictures that very year. Initially, Fairbanks was the most prolific, turning out a series of successful films, including His Majesty the American, from a new studio constructed in partnership with Mary Pickford in the heart of Hollywood. Griffith bought back the negative of his recently finished Broken Blossoms from Adolf Zucker for 3 times what it took to make it and released it through United Artists. A tragic story of interracial love, it was proclaimed a masterpiece by the critics and went on to make 3 times again what Griffith had paid for it.
D.W. Griffith was also remembered for not only epic films, but for very small films, which were done on an epic level. His stories had to do with individuals conquering intense problems or great obstacles in life.
Ever the practical businesswoman, Mary Pickford temporarily put off her dreams of performing more mature roles and picked for herself the most surefire vehicle she could find. The result was Pollyanna, which went on to gross well over $1 million worldwide. United Artists was off the ground, flying in grand style. The decade of the 1920s became the decade of United Artists. Each of the founders went on to phenomenal success. Within the year, Mary and Douglas were united in marriage. Chaplin's Tramp, Fairbanks's Rogue, and Pickford's Innocent Child were each seen in their most memorable incarnations. Names that still thrill an audience fill the screen. Robin Hood, Little Annie Rooney, The Gold Rush, In addition to the stars who started the studio, important films were made by the likes of Rudolph Valentino and Gloria Swanson. More than this, the world of film advanced beyond its adolescence. No longer were the men who held patents on movie machines the dominant force in deciding what the public would see on screen. And if, eventually, the money men would win out, at least for a time, there was a golden decade of prosperity and unrestrained invention for the artists. Truly, they created their own star power, and in doing so, they helped to build Hollywood.